Good evening to all present. Welcome to this special session at the Institute of Chinese Studies. The topic under discussion today is Ukraine crisis, a tightrope for Chinese diplomacy. We have amongst us three eminent speakers and a discussant. Our first speaker today is Ambassador Shamsaran, who is a former Foreign Secretary of India and has served as Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. He is currently Life Trustee of India International Center, member of the Governing Council at the Institute of Chinese Studies and Center for Policy Research. Also joining us today is Professor Dave, who is currently professor in the Department of International Relations, Tsinghua University. He is also the Deputy Director of the Center for International Strategy and Security at Tsinghua. Our next speaker would be Professor Michael Flair, who's Five College Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies and Director of the Five College Program in Peace and World Security Studies. He has written widely on the US military policy, international peace and security affairs, the global arms trade, and global resource politics. Joining us as discussant today is Professor Anuradha Chenoy, who's professor and former dean, retired from the School of International Studies, JNU. Currently, she is adjunct professor, School of International Affairs at the Jindal Global University. Chairing the session today is Professor Hemant Adlakha, who's Associate Professor at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, School of Language, Literature and Cultural Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's Vice Chairperson and Honorary Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all our panelists. Participants are requested to note the housekeeping rules. All participants are to stay muted during the presentation. Questions can be posed in the chat box anytime during the presentations or using the raise hand option during the Q&A session. Please unmute only when called upon by the chair to do so. Over to the chair.
Thank you, Shruti. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Let me join Shruti and once again welcome you all to today's panel discussion. I'm particularly grateful to our four speakers who, at a very short notice, very kindly agreed to participate in today's event, despite their very, very busy schedule. So I'm very grateful to them. As you all have seen the purpose of statement for today's discussion, which was actually written 10 days ago. So in addition to the concept note or abstract which has been circulated, let me quickly add a couple of sentences more. In addition to the concept note in the circulated e-poster of today's event, I just wish to say, as someone had said, the causes of a war are revealed not in how a war begins, but in how it develops and to what it leads to. So, as a principal opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which wages on into its day 20, we at the same time also must, in an uncompromising opposition manner, oppose the NATO and the US. In other words, the Ukraine war crisis must be understood in its historical context and not just looking at it from a realist perspective by which the war in Ukraine is the result of this monster called Putin. I think that will be a folly. We must also question the US continuous funding of bioweapons lab in Ukraine. We must also question the speedy expansion of NATO. And why can't actually US disband NATO? Isn't it high time that NATO obituary should be written? With these words, I invite our first speaker of the evening, Ambassador Shamsaran. Sir, floor is yours.
Thank you, Hemant. Let me also greet all my fellow panelists. Hemant, let me begin by entirely disagreeing with you, particularly the last sentences that you have added. Because whatever be the rights and wrongs of what the US or the West is doing, I see no justification whatsoever for the kind of invasion and the huge amount of suffering which has been visited upon innocent men, women, and children in Ukraine. So setting aside, the argument about who started it all and whether expansion of NATO was really the cause, that did not justify, I think, Russia carrying out this kind of a war against a fellow country or neighbor. So I just wanted to make that position clear. Secondly, I think today we are talking about, the Ukraine crisis and what it means in terms of tightrope, policy for Chinese diplomacy. Well, I think today's meeting is one tightrope walker, discussing the situation with another tightrope walker. I presume that both the tightrope walkers have something in common in terms of how they are responding to this situation. But let me try and give you a sense of what I see as the Chinese position and what is likely to happen as this war continues to roll on. So one, I think it is to me very clear that the position which China has taken on this issue is very similar to the position it took during the occupation of Crimea. There also, I think what is important to note is that while the overall principle of respecting territorial integrity and sovereignty, national sovereignty, it has been reiterated, but in that case also, China's made a reference to, and I quote, complex intertwinement of historical and contemporary factors, and that if that resolution which they abstained on, like they did this time, if that resolution was passed, then this would only complicate matters. So if you look at that history, what they are doing on the invasion of Ukraine is not very different from the position which they took at that time. The interesting thing to note is that in this case, China has had to, in fact, somehow begin to, in a sense, condition its support for national sovereignty and territorial integrity by saying, yes, this is an important principle, but we must take into account the historical factor, the expansion of NATO, which Hemant made a reference to, or that the quoting Mearsheimer, that if you poke the bear in the eye, the bear is going to react. So there has been a certain conditioning of this principle of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, this time much more than during the time of the Crimean War. The other aspect is that I think perhaps China did not face a major kind of a dilemma in the Crimean case because it was over very, very quickly. I think there may have been expectation that this too will be over very quickly, faced with the overwhelming power of the Russian military. Perhaps Ukraine would, accept the major demands of Russia, but that did not happen. And the longer this war continues, the dilemma for China will also continue to mount in seriousness, as it were. So in this context, I think one of the most important things to remember is that while China and Russia are united together in what has been announced as a relationship with no limits, and Wang Yi, even after several days of this war, mentioned that the partnership between the two countries is rock solid. So does not seem to be any daylight as yet between China and Russia. But I do foresee that the situation, not just for China, but I think for India too, it will become more difficult to handle for a few developments which I see. One is that this war is not going Russia's way. So even if, my view is that even if Russia was able to completely decimate any opposition in Ukraine, literally leaves Ukraine in a rubble after this is over, what would it have gained? So if the idea was that the attack against Ukraine is Russia's passport to a new security order in Europe, a new kind of a Helsinki process, in fact, what has been achieved is exactly the reverse. You have a much more united Europe. You have a European Union which started off as an economic arrangement, and now it has developed a military dimension as well. The kind of unity that you see amongst the major Western European powers and the United States, this is also something which we have not seen for a very long time. Will Russia's demands, even if it wins in Ukraine, in this changed situation, will there be a willingness on the part of the West to give any quarter to Russian demands with regard to its security interests? Not likely. Second, I think it is also important to note that here you are dealing with a power which may be very large in area, a superpower in terms of its nuclear arsenal, its military, but it is a diminishing economy. It is the 11th largest economy in the world today, and all the various metrics are showing that Russia, relatively speaking, will continue to decline. And I think what this particular adventure or misadventure has done is actually Russia becoming a much more diminished economy than it was in the past. And literally what has happened to Russia is that it has been unplugged from the global network. And in today's world, being unplugged from the global network has very, very serious consequences. And those are already playing out in Russia. So I see us at the threshold of actually Russia having not achieved any of its aim, and in the bargain has become a much more diminished power, as I said before. Now, for China, what does this mean? I think for China, what this means is that its assumption in terms of the strategic partnership, which was announced on February 4, that it would have next to it a very substantial power, at least in military terms and in terms of its, resources, it would be a very important ally for China. I think that assumption will need to be revisited. Instead of being a kind of a ballast to Chinese ambitions, it is likely to become a liability. And how will China react to that is something very interesting that we will have to see. The other aspect that I wanted to draw finally attention to is the fact that the United States of America, while in the longer term it will still continue to decline, relatively speaking, I think that particular trend is unlikely to be reversed. But in the short run, as a result of the Ukraine war and the kind of consequences it has had, I think that in the near term, the tactical advantage is today after a long time with the United States of America. And the United States of America is actually using that advantage. And that is very apparent in the kind of stance taken by Jake Sullivan in his recent meeting with Yang Jiechi in Rome, where you see the United States of America literally holding out a very serious threat to China on becoming a target for secondary sanctions. What do I see China doing in reaction? I will see China being rhetorically very anti-US, make a lot of noise about the double standards which the US follows and the West follows, will continue to perhaps also make statements in support of Russia and the reasons why it had to take this action. But my sense is that it will not do anything to act. Well, let me put it this way. It will not do anything to actually support the US-led sanctions or international sanctions against Russia. But at the same time, it will do nothing to oppose many of those serious sanctions, because this would mean that China itself will risk what has been actually the major driver of its prosperity, which is the globalization of its economy. So, and let me end with saying that how this plays out, of course, has lessons for India. I think our room for maneuver, relatively speaking, has also somewhat shrunk. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran. I'm sure you will have many questions to answer. Let me now quickly, because the time is limited, let me quickly turn to Professor Tave. Have you unmuted?
Okay. Yeah. Am I audible? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Hammond, and thank ICS for having me for this very interesting discussion. Chinese diplomacy on tightrope. Actually, as Mr. Saran pointed out, I think India is also on the tightrope. A very interesting situation we are in, and actually I'm also very interested in the reason why India is in the similar situation as China, and how can India get rid of the pressure from the West. Actually this afternoon I discussed with my colleague about how can India work on this tightrope while not being blamed by the West. That's something China should learn from India. But back to our topic, I will share with our India friends, I think, two things. One is the discussion in China about on this issue. Another thing is, I think several viewpoints of China need to be noticed by our India and India friends and friends from other countries. I think first about how do we, I mean, I use we mean Chinese strategic community, how do we view this war or this conflict? I think it's being very closely noticed, followed by Chinese academic circle on media and also social media. And it's very divisive now in China regarding this war. I will say half to half, and maybe among intellectuals, maybe majority people are sympathizing Ukraine. But if you ask average Chinese, ordinary Chinese, I think the majority are on Russia side. But though it's divisive, I think there are several majority view. The first majority view is, I believe that the majority of us believe that Russia has not fought a good war. It's prepared not very well, and its strategic goal is not clear enough. Second majority view is we believe that the US benefits from this war the most. Well, no matter what kind of outcome we will see in Ukraine militarily, I think Russia lost the most strategically and politically. I think the U.S. Benefit. I think the biggest benefit the U.S. has gained is solidify its alliance system and unite the European countries together. I think so. That's they really benefit from that. The third majority view is, I think, majority people here believe that this war has a major impact on international order, and it accelerates the end of the post-Cold War international order, and moving us quickly to a new order, which I think be characterized by major power competition and also end of the maybe not end, but at least a lower level of interconnectedness, lower level of openness. I think this will actually accelerate that trend in Europe and already end the post-Cold War order in Europe. While we on the other side of the continent, I think we have been witness this change in Indo-Pacific in past 8 years. But on our side of the continent, I think this is a process. It's evolved for many years, but in Europe, it's a very rapid change, dramatic change, and the old order was ended. So those are the three mainstream view, I think, in China regarding this war. And then I have seven small points that I want to share with our Indian friends about China's position. The first one is, I believe probably China did not know Putin will launch the war before we read it from media. Though Putin visited Beijing before the Winter Olympic, I believe that he did not share with us explicitly his idea. One of the evidence is China did not withdraw Chinese from Ukraine. If we knew that, I think we will, make some. We should prepare to withdraw Chinese, but we didn't. So we were in quite difficult situation in Ukraine regarding the overseas Chinese there. The second thing is, of course, as our topic suggests today, China feel very difficult between Ukraine and Russia. Both countries are China's friends. Of course, we call Russia a strategic partner, but we do have very good relations with Ukraine. So we don't want to see Ukraine be invaded. And of course, we don't want to see Russia in a bad situation. China is a country that suffered from foreign intervention and the invasion in history. So actually, China is very sensitive to this kind of invasion. So the third point I would like to share is the reason why I think the main reason behind this dilemma, behind China's dilemma, is the U.S. Actually, if we go to the fact, I think the fact is simple. Russia invaded Ukraine, and I agree with Mr. Shamsaran that NATO expansion may be too risky, too dangerous, but it's not an excuse for Russia to invade Ukraine. But the problem is why China then sympathize Russia. I think one reason is we have felt similar geopolitical pressure from the US as Russian felt. Russia, faced the NATO expansion, and we in China also faced the U.S. alliance system in the region in past, 3 decades after the end of the Cold War. And China in recent years has a very tense relations with the U.S. Then now Russia has bad relation with the U.S. Many people in China ask, why should we betray Russia? Why shouldn't we support them? Since enemy's enemy is our friend, right? I personally don't agree with this calculation, but I'm describing many people's calculation in China. And moreover, even if we try to keep distance from Russia, what can we gain from the West? We may lost our friend in Russia, but we cannot gain new friends in the West. So the fourth point I want to point it out is China's position should not be simplified as supporting Russia. I think that's different. I think, yes, China sympathizes Russia to some extent, but I think we need to notice that we have very nuanced elaboration of our position, particularly today. Mr. Yang Jiechi again, elaborates China's position regarding Ukraine, and it's slightly different from the old positions we have already seen, like what Wang Yi said a couple of days ago. And today, Yang Jiechi only mentioned actually three things. One thing is we don't want to see the Ukraine crisis, and we respect sovereignty and territory integrity, and we honor UN Charter. This is the first point, and we said that we should support the peace negotiation. So basically, this show our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territory integrity. And the second point he mentioned today is about the history, about why that happened, but he did not mention Russia's name. He didn't mention Russia, but in his first point, he mentioned Ukraine. And the third point he made was oppose those rumors regarding China. I will mention this later. So you can see Yang Jiechi today's position expressed by Yang Jiechi is different from, slightly different, I think, from Wang Yi a couple of days ago. The fifth point I would like to mention is, I think in US media, Western media, there are some reports regarding China, which I think is very, very irresponsible and unprofessional. Ruthless accusation about China. So that's, I think those mainstream Western media is violating their journalism, I think, spirit of the journalism. There's no evidence, and there's no information source, just accuse China for doing this and doing that. I think that's really sad. The sixth point is, I think China emphasized that now, no matter who is correct and who is wrong, or maybe this is not the most important thing to find out who is, who should be blamed. The most important thing today now is to try to achieve peace and also providing humanitarian aids to the people suffered from the war. So China has already provided Ukraine humanitarian aids. And also China is working with other European countries try to facilitate negotiation. And today's talk between Yang Jiechi and Jake Sullivan, I think, is also an effort. The last point is China. I want to echo what Mr. Sarin mentioned, that Chinese company, though we don't like sanction, but probably I guess most Chinese company will comply with the sanction because the companies do not want to be unplugged from the international system. I think from pure economic interest, they will do that. Chinese government cannot make decisions for our companies. So that's decisions made based on market logic. Okay, I think I spoke too long. I should stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tawei. As was expected of you, like always, you always surprise us with sharing with us very candidly and frankly views and opinions which we otherwise sometimes do not come to know from the media or the writings of the Chinese scholars. So thank you very much. I next request our third speaker, Professor Michael Flair.
So hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion. I've already learned from the previous speakers. I took careful notes and I might refer to them because they coincide with what I have to say. First, to reinforce the notion that from my personal perspective, and what I hear from my colleagues and what I think is a common view in Washington is we are in a new world. Let's be very clear. The post-Cold War era is over, and whatever views or principles, ideas, strategies that prevailed before February 24th are no longer valid. So we really have to think differently about this world. And I agree with Tawei and Ambassador Saran that this is a world of competing blocks, competing power centers, a geopolitical struggle for dominance on the global map. That I think is my interpretation of where things are today. So that's just an observation. But for my own comments, I have a number of points. I'm going to try to get through these as quickly as I can so we could have discussion. The first thing is, I hope this is clear to you all, and you probably know this, but American foreign policy is made by a very small group of people, a very isolated, unrepresentative, self-electing group of people. We call it the foreign policy establishment, the foreign policy elite, whatever name you want to give it. We call it the blob in Washington. It's made up of former generals and admirals, people in the think tanks, the top think tank people, the leading pundits in the media, and academics, leading academics who repeat what each other says and replace them with like-minded people who went to the same universities and have the same outlook. And this foreign policy establishment has had one very simple, single outlook since the end of the Cold War, and it persists today. And that is that the United States must remain the world's dominant power now and forever by any means necessary, and must prevent any other power from coming even close to the United States in net economic and technological and military power. Now, this is just a uniform point of view. The blob has long felt, at least for 20 years, that China represents the greatest potential threat to overtaking the United States as the dominant power. And therefore, everything must be done to prevent China from ever achieving that status by whatever means are necessary. And this view was first articulated by President Obama in 2011 and has been the view of the foreign policy establishment ever since. However, sometimes the foreign policy establishment doesn't control things. And we had a very powerful emotional response to 9/11 and to terrorism in this country. And that meant that the war on terror took over was the dominant military strategic priority from September 2001 until 2018, and that was in the forefront. And for American strategists, for the foreign policy establishment, this was a distraction, a strategic disaster, a distraction that wasted American resources in unimportant places like Afghanistan, wasted American power and resources while China and Russia were able to gain strength, to rebuild their military in the case of Russia, to expand its military on the part of China, and that therefore the global war on terror was a distraction that had to be eliminated. And this was the case until 2018, when the foreign policy establishment undertook what essentially I call a strategic coup d'etat. Even though President Trump was in power, they ignored his preferences. And in 2018, you have the release of the National Defense Strategy, the NDS, written by Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, which says the global war on terror is over. And from now on, not over, but is being made a marginal concern. From now on, great power competition, GPC, great power competition, is the defining strategic objective of the US. And specifically, that means containing Russia in Europe and containing China in Asia. And to that end, the US would revitalize NATO and build up NATO, particularly on the front line of NATO, what's called the front line, the countries closest to Russia, Poland and the Baltic states, Romania, that the forces would be moved the center of gravity of NATO would be moved eastward towards Russia. In the Pacific, where you didn't have a NATO, it called for the creation of a parent NATO, or a proto-NATO, I call it, the Quad, India, Australia, Japan, and the US. And then more recently, a closer alliance between Australia and the UK and the US. But the intent is to create a foundation for an Asian NATO to encircle China. Now, this was the case under President Trump, who wasn't aware that all this was going on, and then that became the foreign policy of the Biden administration. In this time, the focal point became Taiwan, and I was terribly afraid that by the end of 2022. There would be a crisis over Taiwan that could have led to a war with China. And let's not rule that out yet. As it turned out, the first response to this strategy of encirclement occurred over Ukraine. And that's where we stand now. So the foreign policy establishment has now decided. I'm not part of it, please understand. I'm a critic and an outsider. So when I talk about this, these are my impressions. But the foreign policy establishment in Washington has now come together, total unity. And the first priority is to crush Russia, to destroy Russia. Russia will be destroyed. That is the intent, one way or the other. We have the power, the economic power and the military power. One way or the other, Russia will be turned into a diminished former power, by whatever means, whatever economic means we have will be employed to bring Russia to its knees. And it will be punished terribly, and the Russian people will suffer as a consequence of this. But that is the current intent of the foreign policy establishment, is to punish Russia and the people around Putin for what happened. And this has nothing to do with the suffering of the Ukrainian people. That's just being leveraged. So long as the war goes on and there's images in the media of Ukrainian suffering, that will be used by Congress and the foreign policy establishment to justify ever more severe punishments of Russia. What about China? And let me finish with some comments now about China. China will not be allowed to assume a neutral position, nor India for that matter. As far as the foreign policy establishment is concerned, there is a new global struggle for power underway, being led by the United States and its allies, and you must join us in the struggle to destroy Russia, to contain and destroy Russia, or you are an accomplice of Russia. So you cannot remain neutral. This is not an option from the point of view of the people down the street from me. So China will come under pressure to cut off any support for Russia, any visible support for Russia, and there will be demands. If not from Jake Sullivan, it's going to come from Congress. Congress is on the warpath and will impose, it will write the law that any country that buys oil from or gas from Russia will be penalized in the international system. Any country that trades with Russia will be penalized. This will be written into law. It will not be a matter of discretion. So you will see the screws being tightened. There will be more. So how do I see this in the future? A lot aligns with what you've heard from the other speakers. I think we're moving into a time of deglobalization. That was underway in the Trump period. It's accelerating. Now the pace of deglobalization will accelerate. Under the law that is before Congress, the U.S. Innovation and Strategic Competition Act, which Biden wants to be passed as soon as possible, vast amounts of money, hundreds of billions of dollars will be spent to duplicate supply lines from China with American supply and allied supply lines to make China less relevant in international trade and to cut off access to China of American technology and the technology of any country, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Australia, Europe, any country that trades technology with China, if it is complicit with Russia, will be cut off. And this will accelerate. There will be a vast military buildup as a result of the war in Ukraine. And the weapons that'll be procured will not be intended for Russia because Russia is already a diminishing power, as was noted earlier, but all the new weapons will be aimed at defeating China. Naval buildup, especially high technology weapons, hypersonic weapons. The buildup of the alliances, because the countries that the US relies on are united with the US against Russia. Japan, we have a new, nobody mentioned there's election in South Korea. Now we have a very anti-China president in South Korea, which will be favorable now to a stronger US military presence. The Japanese government is more favorable to a stronger military presence. And what I fear is that tension over Taiwan will come back, as I said. So I worry about Taiwan. So I pray that the Chinese leadership will see this and take steps to disassociate itself from Putin's crimes in Ukraine and take a very strong stand. And what Dawei said earlier about the recent comments sounds very hopeful to me, because this is a moment to avoid confrontation as much as possible. So what I try to describe is not what I feel, but what I'm afraid of. And we in the United States now have a responsibility to oppose these trends, but it's going to be very difficult. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Clare, for reminding us with emphasis that we are now in a new world and how you are fearful of this new world. Now we turn to our last speaker come discussant, Professor Anuradha Chinoy. Anuradha, please.
Thank you, Hemant, and friends on this excellent panel. I'm delighted to be here, and I kind of agree with almost everything you all have said. And let me begin by saying that I unconditionally oppose this war, and I do not feel that these kind of wars have any justification. And Russia's war is actually a reflection of the earlier NATO wars. So we oppose all these wars from the global south where we are located. Secondly, about this, I think everyone has agreed as discussed, and I would say that the common points have been that there is going to be a new world order, and I agree with that. But I have one more thing to add to what Professor Clare and Professor Davi added, that this world order is, of course, one in which the United States is going to go all out to seek hegemony, whereas China, India, and others still hold on to the multipolar world that is important for them. But this world order is completely, and this war is completely non-normative. There are no norms behind this world order or the norms, unlike the Second World War, which was an anti-fascist, an anti-fascist war, and other wars which could have been for democracy. This is all about very narrow hegemony, great power hegemony, regional hegemonies, and very, very bare national interest. So I think it's a very sad day for the globe when the actual existential threats are for all of us, climate and ecology and diversity, etc. Whereas now you have a remilitarization right now of Europe, a complete arming of Ukraine, where every household is going to, as they said themselves, have a Molotov bomb. It's a very sad day for Russia. I agree with what Ambassador Shamsaran said. Russia is not in a good position. They have been trapped into this war. The United States has got them, and they're not allowing a diplomatic solution. They are pushing Ukraine. Ukraine is just another collateral damage, just like many of the countries in West Asia was. They've brought this war on. Putin has fallen into this trap. Of course, the deep state in Russia, it's a full system, not just Putin, which saw NATO's expansion to its borders as an existential threat. But I don't think they clearly calculated the kind of, reinvigoration of NATO and its move. Also because continuously the American narrative has been that China is the main threat, China is the main threat, and that continues. And in the long run, it is. Now, as far as this question about China's position, I see in it a great continuity from earlier positions, where they have always spoken about China's peaceful rise as opposed to the militarist rise of other hegemonic powers. So China is not interested in any deep confrontation. their rise is linked to globalization, to economic competition and its economic, financial, technological superiority. But the US is trying to curb that also. And I think they realize that, so they're going to try and ensnare China into some kind of similar kind of confrontation, as Professor Flair has said. Now, as far as this other narrative, which is so popular in mainstream press, not just in the US, but also in the global South, as I see it, is that Russia and China are going to get so close, and this is a threat for all others. I mean, China has taken a position actually, which is very similar to the rest of the global South, of having a strong rhetoric, of condemning the war, of condemning, opposing NATO expansion, also asking for diplomatic solutions, but opposing sanctions. And if you look at the map of sanctions, all the countries of the global South, none of them are in favor of unilateral sanctions, but they're worried. And similarly with India. India, in fact, in its parliament has said that they would like now to source Russian oil. India is dependent on Russian military equipment. They have a long-standing strategic partnership. Their partnership with the United States is new and untested. And so this is the time that they would test it. So in these circumstances, this is my last point, as since there's so much agreement and between all the speakers, including me on almost all the points, is that now I think in this new world order, India and China need to also review who their allies are and build new allies, because these are the powers. All the BRICS countries, India, China, South Africa, Brazil, all of them abstained, and they've all opposed sanctions in their narrative. So, and the US attempt will be to destroy groupings like the BRICS, etc., and push for its dollar and 100 other different kind of methodologies. They've smelt blood, and they feel that they can revive their hegemonic empire. So really, China and India have to review their own relationships. These are very critical for the Asia-Pacific. I think India's position vis-a-vis Russia, the official position, I'm nowhere part or never been part of the establishment. But this position was, I've said this publicly, has been a correct position of neutrality and some kind of silence, but at the same time, recognizing that that Russia has legitimate security interests, and that Russia has not been a threat to the global South. They were not colonizers. Racism is not part of their policy. And they hope that this multipolarity, where Russia is also an important part, along with China, continues. Sadly, this may not happen, as we've seen. But in that case, India and China need to especially review their relations with each other and build on new grounds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chenoy. I must acknowledge and express my gratitude to all the speakers for sticking to time. I think our timekeeper actually has slept off. Anyway, since I have the privilege of moderating this discussion, so I'll quickly use my privilege as chair and pose one question each to all the four speakers. And I begin with my question to Ambassador Shamsaran. Ambassador Shamsaran did mention in his 10 minutes presentation that China more or less took the same position in this Ukrainian war crisis as it took the position during the Crimea annexation. But perhaps China did not anticipate that the situation will continue for so long, unlike the Crimea situation. So my question to you, Ambassador Saran, is that, as Professor Tave has already said, that China did not know about the Russian special military operation on Ukraine. Even if it is true, now that we are in the day 20 of the Russian invasion, do you think, and I think you know better than any one of us, what miscalculation means in diplomacy or foreign policy? Do you think China really miscalculated the Russian continuous invasion in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I think that is a question that perhaps Professor Dave would be better qualified to answer. Let me just make a couple of points. One is, I think we should perhaps in a discussion like this, stay a little away from taking very moralistic and ethical positions, because frankly speaking, to somehow paint Russia as anti-colonialist and anti-great power, or China as anti-great power, that's simply not true. China is very, very cynical about the deployment of its power to achieve what it regards as its national interest. And by the way, I mean, I'm not excusing India from that particular behavior pattern, but I think, you know, we are making the mistake of trying to frame this as some kind of a moral position, and who has a relatively better moral position than say the United States. That the United States has the worst moral position, the others are relatively better. I think we should avoid getting into that kind of a argument. The United States of America sees a certain opportunity to be able to, you know, salvage some of its reduced hegemony, as was mentioned. And it will take that. It will try and take that, leverage that opportunity. If that were to come to China, I have no doubt that China would do the same. So the logic of the February 4 statement in Beijing was precisely this: that, you know, a ascendant China, a strong, you know, Russia working together could actually shape the international order in a manner that, in fact, safeguards their interests, promotes their interests as they see it. So I think we should be a little careful in coming to conclusions about this. So did China know that Russia was going to have this invasion? Even if it did not know, it was aware of the fact that there was a controversy brewing, a major controversy brewing. It knew that a charter of demands had been made to the United States and the NATO members. It knew that 100,000 or more troops, Russian troops, were in fact, you know, ranged across the border in Ukraine. You know, prudence would have demanded that China should have been a little careful about where this could perhaps lead. So whether was this a miscalculation? I don't know, but the subsequent events, as they have panned out, are showing that China today, and I'm saying India is too, China today is in a somewhat defensive position compared to, say, 3 weeks ago, and that is not going to change in a hurry. Are there ways in which India and China can perhaps work together on this? Maybe, but I'm not so sure that our Chinese friends are really interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran. The question I asked you, and you said that perhaps that would have been better put to Professor Dave. I did not, because I have another question for Professor Dave. And Professor Dave, my question to you is, as you had mentioned in your brief presentation, that you had discussed this question today with your colleagues about India also is in a typical similar position like in China. And also and China should learn from how India will come out of such situation. vis-a-vis the West. So my question to you is that I've recently seen a couple of articles by some leading Chinese strategic affairs analysts, and they have said that India actually very much wanted to support Russia, but did not do so because that would have meant advantage China. Is that, I mean, do you share this view, or what would you say on that?
I don't know. I think actually I believe India is in a better position than China. I said that China should learn from US, but actually it's very hard because basically put it in a very simple way, India stands behind China. So you are a rising power, but China is in front of you. So as a major challenger, rival, maybe even enemy, as Professor Claire pointed out from the Western perspective. So we don't have the luxury that India enjoys today of keeping, some disagreement, differences from the West while keeping a general harmonious position, harmonious relationship with the West. China, it's impossible for China. So India enjoys this unique position very much. I think that's your, anyway, it's a little bit like, let's say 4 decades ago, China stood behind Russia or Soviet Union at that time. So, so at that time, the major contradiction was between between the US and the Soviet Union. So China enjoying the space to maneuver, but now we don't have. Yeah, we know that India and Russia have very good relations for a long time, and also for many reasons, particularly security reason. But we still believe that generally speaking, India is getting closer to the West rather than Russia in recent, in last decade at least. So this is my understanding of the situation between us.
Thank you, Professor Tawey. And my question to Professor Michael Clare. Professor Clare, as you mentioned in your presentation, that the foreign policy establishment in the United States of America, at least for the past or since last 20 years, is very clear that a rising China is a potential threat for challenging the US dominating the world, or the US hegemony from continuing. So do you think, of course, we all know, as Professor Chenoy mentioned, that Russia has been baited into invading Ukraine. And even if we say, for the sake of argument, that it's true, but if we look at the propaganda war going on between China and the United States on the one hand, and also as both Ambassador Saran and Professor Tawey referred to the meeting between Jack Sullivan and Yang Jiechi in Rome, do you think that the actual target, I mean, media, of course, is making us believe that it is US and NATO versus Russia in Ukraine war crisis, but actually the US target is China, not Russia. What do you say on that?
Well, I don't know. Let me step back a minute. I want to just say something to put everything in perspective in my mind. And by the way, I thought I want to say Anu Chenoy's summary was excellent. I thought that was a very good summary of our comments. And I want to draw on that first before I answer your question, Hemant. I like to refer to a Soviet doctrine from the 1960s and 70s. Some of you may remember the doctrine of the correlation of forces. I don't know if this is a term that you're familiar with, but it was very prevalent during the Cold War period. How Soviet strategists thought about the US defeat in Vietnam and the rise of the third world, as it was called at that time, the correlation of forces was favoring the socialist countries, the developing world, and the West was in decline. And the correlation of forces included not only military power and industrial power, but also the morale of your soldiers, the morale of the home front, and the corresponding morale and home front of your adversary, geography, resources. All of this would explain the outcome of a conflict. And Russian scholars saw that the US lacked in Vietnam, the correlation of forces was against the US. And US strategists then took that strategy and applied it against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And this was a conscious decision that the Soviet Union could be destroyed because of its overreach in Afghanistan, where the correlation of forces were unfavorable to the Soviet Union, and everything could be done there because the home front in Russia was not in favor of the war, whereas in Afghanistan, the home front or the people were supportive of the rebels. So why do I say this? Because I think that Russian and Chinese analysts misread where the US was at over the past few years. I think scholars saw around the world saw the US withdrawal from Afghanistan as a defeat for the US, as a sign of US weakness, as a sign of Allied disarray, that the US was in retreat. And this is a misreading of the situation. The foreign policy establishment had wanted to leave Afghanistan years ago. And even though the withdrawal was bungled, it was part of the strategic plan to move the US out of that part of the world and move its chess pieces, its best chess pieces, to two places, to Europe on the front line against Russia and to the Asia-Pacific to oppose China. So from a US foreign policy strategic point of view, Afghanistan was a gain, not a loss, not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. And I think Vladimir Putin and his aides, if you read what they were saying after Afghanistan, and I think it's same thing in China, that this is evidence of a Western decline. And it was a total misreading of the correlation of forces. The correlation of forces at this moment favors the West. And this may change in time, but right now, that is the case. The West is united against Russia and will be united against China if it is perceived as continuing to support Russia in any fashion. So China and India are in a very delicate position. Tightrope may be one way of putting it, but I think China and India are going to have to show some degree of alignment with the West against Russia, or expect to be exposed to punishment. I'm not saying any of this with any degree of sympathy. It makes me sad because I think we're headed to a world of greater conflict and confrontation. But I think when we have to be scientists about this and look at the world with open eyes and see that that is where things stand today. And if we're going to oppose it, we have to think this trend towards militarism and polarization. That is what we have to oppose, and think about how to create an international international solidarity against militarism and polarization, and on some basis. That's where I think we are today.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Clare. Now, a quick question, last question from my side to Professor Chenoy. Although Michael gave you a great thumbs up sign for your summing up of the discussion, but I think if I remember it correctly, you did mention in positive sense the position of India. And I think you said that this kind of neutrality is really welcome. Whereas Professor Clare very clearly told us that countries like India will not be allowed to have a neutrality in this kind of situation. So what do you think about what Professor Clare is saying, especially in the context of Russia and China analysts having misread the US troops withdrawal from Afghanistan? Do you think in India also it was misread?
No, as far as this, of course, there's going to be massive pressure on India to choose sides now. There already is. The American and a lot of Western strategic community is constantly saying they're shocked at India. Why? We can't understand why they've taken this position, which means they have not even read Indian foreign policy correctly. You know, so there are misreadings from all sides. Now, even if you see the last Quad meeting, the US has been trying to make it more of a military alliance, but India did resist that and said that it should be restricted to technology, maritime security, environment, etc. So they're still walking that tightrope where they do not want their relationship with the United States and West to be at the cost of their other relationships, and that is with either Russia or the rest of the global South. Of course, the global South doesn't matter now because they don't have that kind of old bonding or movement. It's all about national interest, as Ambassador Shamsaran put it very clearly. But someone somewhere needs to have some moral restraint in this kind of position where there is no such thing as a conscious or morality or an understanding of what is actually happening globally. So India is in this tight position, but I think they also have the leverage they have averted sanctions earlier. They have, when India went for the bomb and the United States put sanctions, that was a time when Russia bypassed it. And India was able to leverage its position. So they do have the strength and the ability to sidestep some of these, and I hope they do in the future also. But I mean, one has to see how the future and correlation of forces or peaceful competition and all these wonderful epithets if they continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chenoy. And now, before we go into the question and answers round, our last segment, I would like to request the representative of our co-host, The Print. I'm sorry, I'm not aware who is representing The Print today. If he or she is here, he or she may ask her or his questions to the panelists. Shruti, do we have someone?
Sir, not that we're aware of. But
थोड़ा सा देना चाहिए मुझे like this देखो पानी हो गया चेक कर लो सकते हैं.
Okay, so if we do not have someone from the press, can I then request Shruti to help us conduct the question and answer session?
Sure, sir. So the first question that we have is for Ambassador Sharan. And the question goes, as far as recent news, okay, so the question is about how the Russia-Ukraine war is going to affect the China-Taiwan mission. and this is by Mr. Indrajit.
Yeah, so, I think there are, again, I'm not certain I'm the right person to talk about how this will affect the Taiwan issue. But let me just speculate, perhaps, what could happen. One is that if the United States of America senses a certain defensiveness on the part of China as a result of the Ukraine war. Secondly, if it is also true that the United States of America is really focused upon China as its peer rival for global power, then I suspect that there will be efforts on the part of the United States to further beef up the military, strength of Taiwan. There could be a notion that here is a very weak country like Ukraine, without too much resources or military strength, and yet it has been able to keep Russia, completely bogged down in Ukraine. Is this something which could be a possible scenario in Taiwan if China decides to, bring about unification through the use of force? I know that China has been repeatedly stating that there is really no comparison between the two because Taiwan's status as a province of China has already been accepted, acknowledged by most of the world, and therefore it does not have the same issue of legitimacy as perhaps the Ukraine issue has. Be that as it may, these kind of notions, which I consider to be somewhat dangerous notions, could in fact begin to take hold in the permanent establishment in the US that Professor Flair has been talking about. So I do think that there is a danger of the Taiwan issue perhaps becoming an even more live issue than it has been so far. But that's my sort of perception. Is it very well founded? I don't know, but it is based on what I see as the kind of thinking that we have witnessed in the United States.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran. Shruti, next question, please.
Sir, should we take a couple of questions at the same time or should we go one by one?
It's clearly mentioned whom the question is addressed to, then we can go one by one quickly. And I'll request the panelists to be very brief so that we can accommodate more questions.
This question is not directed to anyone in particular, but Mr. Raj Gupta asks, will the Russian action on Ukraine and China's non-opposition to it fuel the larger debate of democracy versus authoritarianism, which already exists in the US-China trade power competition? He also asks, what diplomatic position suits China best if in the coming future, Russia is able to pull off a regime change in Ukraine?
Okay, so since it is not addressed to any specific panelist, who would like to come in? Can I request you, Professor Claire?
I would be happy to answer that if you would summarize the question for me. I had some difficulty getting the gist of the question.
The question referred to the larger debate of democracy versus authoritarianism. So will this crisis fuel that debate again? And yeah, that's the first question.
Well, that things going on at once. As I indicated, and the other speakers have noted, and Anu in a summary pointed out, this is a struggle for hegemony or comparative, or I'd rather say it's a struggle for comparative advantage on the global strategic chessboard, a classical geopolitical struggle without any moral basis. It's a struggle for power between the United States and its allies on one side and what they see as competitors on the other side, Russia and China, and maybe in the future, India as a competitor. So it has no moral dimension. But always when you're trying to rally the public behind your position, you have to give it a moral dimension. And the Biden administration has worked very hard to give some glue, some moral cement to this alliance building, and that's democracy and freedom versus authoritarianism. And to some degree, they've succeeded with that, thanks to Mr. Putin, who's given people in Europe a sense that indeed freedom and democracy are under assault from authoritarianism. So this ideology has gained a degree of legitimacy. I'd like to point out at the same time, it has eliminated more or less efforts by the European Union to insist that its own members abide by democracy. Up until the outbreak of the war, the European Union was about to impose penalties on Poland and Hungary for their failure to abide by the requirements for the rule of law and democratic process in those countries, but precisely because they were authoritarian, moving in an authoritarian direction. But of course, that will now be forgotten completely, is being forgotten completely. Nonetheless, there is this ideological dimension has been added on top of this geopolitical struggle.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Clare. Next question, please.
This is a question from Mr. Subhojit Ghosh, and he asks, are we entering a new Cold War era? It's not directed to anyone.
Professor Chenoy, would you like to take it?
What I'd say is that, are we entering a new Cold War? I think parts of the Cold War didn't end because NATO continued. It continued to expand. The over 500 US military bases continued to thrive. There was an attempt of, this narrative of the peace dividend when Russia was down and out for 2 decades. But it was a kind of a triumphalist position till Russia got strategic parity. And they also believe in a sense of their spheres of interest and their spheres of influence. And they've pushed back. So it is a version of the old, there is an Iron Curtain now. There is an attempt to have the Cold War. And the Cold War, by the way, also was a misnomer because there were proxy wars in Asia and Southeast Asia. So it wasn't a Cold War for some. So I think we need to deconstruct these concepts, because now all that we can hold on to really is how we analyze against this huge, as I think Professor Clare put it very well, this comparative advantage for geostrategic controls by various levels of hegemons, super hegemons, regional hegemons, aspirational hegemons, wannabe hegemons, and others. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chenoy. I think Shruti, next question is to
Professor Dave.
You can combine that with Ambassador Kantha's question, which is also addressed to Professor Tave.
Okay, I will just read out Ambassador Kantha's question first. How do you see the Ukraine crisis and the US preoccupation with it impacting its Indo-Pacific strategy and its determination to counter China? And another question for Professor Tabe is whether there are possibilities for India and China to renew their relationship in this current world order, to create a world order which is free of US or EU interferences.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to answer Ambassador Kantha's question first. I think generally speaking, I don't think the crisis in Ukraine will change the US focus and the preoccupation on China. Of course, from the short run, by short run, I mean, let's say 3 or 6 months or 1 year at the most. I think probably the pace of the US strategic realignment in this region may be slowed. That's possible, but from if we look beyond this year or beyond next 6 months, I think the US Indo-Pacific strategy will not change. And one potential challenge here is I think the US is trying to consolidate its alliance system and try to isolate China, try to band China and Russia together. If that strategy succeeds, China will be in a more difficult position, and the Indo-Pacific strategy will evolve into a purely anti-China strategy. That will be that's something I think India need to notice too. Does India really want to enter that? But of course, I don't want that kind of banding China, Russia together and blaming the two countries together. I don't want that strategy succeed. I hope that China can make clever maneuver and try to maintain our connectedness with the neighboring countries, including India and other neighboring countries. If so, the Indo-Pacific region won't be split into two parts. Then I think we won't see two camps here in this region. I think that will be in everyone's interest. So to answer the question, I think that will not change the US side's strategy, but I think China need to learn from something from this crisis and try to maneuver it cleverly. And to the first question about China, India, I hope we two countries can renew our relationship, of course. And actually the position of India surprised many Chinese. So why can't our two leaders talk to each other by phone? I don't know. Or our senior official exchange views. I think the position of India is refreshing our understanding of India and the potential of China-India commonplace and cooperation. But having that said, because the bilateral relations is in bad shape, realistically speaking, I don't expect any major breakthrough. But since the question is about the possibility, I think the possibility is there, and we need to expand that possibility, turn it into something true. Okay, I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tabe. Shruti, next.
So we have a question from Ambassador Rana, and he asks, if the entire Ukraine situation is a disaster for Russia, why did they miscalculate so badly when they confront only a downside, regardless of what happens in Ukraine? Have they really been so unaware and unmindful of their own interests?
Okay, since it is not addressed to anyone in particular, so anyone among the speakers is most welcome to reply quickly. Ambassador
Okay,
Sara?
quickly, I'll just say,
Okay.
This happens very often with very authoritarian leaders. Putin actually is surrounded by sycophants and and they actually genuinely have seen for decades the expansion of NATO to Ukraine as a red line. And there also this thing about ethnic Russians who found themselves in new countries. It's quite a sore point and quite popular in Russia amongst people that no Russian president can survive if there is a genocide on ethnic Russian minorities. And the fact that Ukraine put these language laws where it made Ukrainian only the language, official language, and it took the language away from huge amounts of Russian-speaking people on the East and in Crimea. All this pushed Russia into some kind of great savior of the Russian people kind of complex, and they thought, and their calculation was that Europe, which was trying for some amount of autonomy, France was upset about the AUKUS deal. Germany wanted the Nord Stream. They did not, I think, calculate enough, and they didn't see the American strategy, which was clearly they want to break Russia away, which will ultimately weaken China. Whereas Trump was constantly saying, forget Russia, just go at China. Biden's strategy was go for both. And you need your allies in Europe, and the allies in Europe are not interested in the Indo-Pacific, but they're interested in Russia as a security threat. So that's how I think they calculated. Sorry, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chenoy. And I think we have run out of time now. I mean, of course, we could have gone and on. I remember when I had first approached Professor Michael Flair to participate in this event, his immediate response was that we are in crazy times. And I think the crazy times continue. Before I thank our panelists, I would like to thank and acknowledge the help we received from our young team in the ICS who brought this event together. Vija, Shruti, Rangoli, Colonel Venkat, and perhaps a few more. And now I thank you all, the participants, and also the speakers. My special thanks to all the 4 speakers. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.